Greetings gamers, Tim here again for about the 13th time I've tried to shoot this video. Long story short is I've got a partition in a hard drive and one side is kind of full and the other side is not, and it keeps trying to save them to the very full partition. Which, there's not a lot I can remove, it's a sad thing. Now, more importantly, today I want to talk about something called intellectual property. I'm not a lawyer, so understand that. What I want to talk about, though, has to do with tabletop role-playing games. And for those of you who are beginning designers designing your first role-playing game, you need to understand this. Ideas are a dime a dozen. Nobody wants your rules in terms of stealing them and running off with them, because functionally you only own the writing around the rules, not the rules themselves. It's got some wiggle room that lawyers could argue about, but functionally speaking, rules cannot be copyrighted with tabletop role-playing games. The way they work, everything else, somebody can write their own version of your rules, and there's not much you can do about it unless you're incredibly wealthy and want to try and pursue that and probably fail. I'm not saying you can't win. Sometimes just having a lawyer and the money will give you a leeway. But the important thing I'm trying to make here is what is important about you writing a role-playing game is the intellectual property, the internal materials that is creative, the fiction. Things like the art you use if you draw it, or buy it, or license it, the fictional races, species, starships, names, planet names, continent names, location names, all of that creation stuff, the stuff you make up beyond the mechanics of the game, are important. And I'm getting to that not because I want to advise you. Get a lawyer if that's a concern to you. But I'm getting to that because I want to talk about a conundrum that I run into. The conundrum is this, is there are companies out there who are willing to buy the big names that other companies have owned that they're not doing anything with. Now, the cost of that name can be inexpensive or it can be huge, and it depends a lot on popularity and a lot of other things. For example, Wizards of the Coast, TSR, back when they were kind of rubbing against each other before they flipped entirely to Wizards of the Coast, and before Hasbro came along and bought Wizards of the Coast, they produced a role-playing game called Alternity, a science fiction role-playing game. It's got some familiar bits, but it's very different from versions of D&D in some ways. It's a skill-based game, but it also has levels and classes. And now all they really do is make skills cheaper. It's weird. But somebody came up and bought the name Alternity, because they're not using it anymore. Somebody bought the name. But what they didn't buy was the alien races, the Star Drive setting, any of the fiction background, any of the made-up stuff, the stuff that people tend to like in a game beyond the rules. There are lots of generic rule systems out there. It's easy to get them. It's easy to use them. Some of them have open license. Some of them just have license. But the rules are not the big issue. Most people, not all, but most people don't necessarily need those specific rules. Now, some people do. Some people like the specific rules. And while the new Alternity game uses a very similar, simplified version of the original Alternity system, they don't have the content that, to me, is the most interesting part, which is the alien races, the science fiction background, any of that. Now, I liked Alternity. I own many of the books. Not my favorite game system by far. But one of the big things that the reason I'm talking about it, there's some contention over another science fiction game that TSR also was involved in. The reason I bring it up is the company is aiming to try and snipe the name away from the people who actually hold the rights to it. Now there is some arguments there over who can actually own it because the trademark lapsed. So that I'm letting lawyers argue that out. I'm not talking about that specifically. But the fact is, they won't own any of the content that I want from Star Frontiers. They won't own Star Frontiers material. They don't own the aliens. They don't own the planets. They don't own any of that. They're just going to have the name Star Frontiers. And I'm sorry, the name isn't big enough to make me go buy a new game unless it's cleaned up rules or new rules that are similar in spirit to the original and all those old alien races. Because those are the things that interest me about the setting. And the setting, admittedly, most science fiction settings are kind of like, well, we took this idea and we filed the numbers off. Star Frontiers has a few more ideas that I haven't seen in other places. That doesn't mean they don't exist in fiction somewhere. For example, there's a big name one that lots more people play than Star Frontiers called Traveler. But I can go through Traveler and go, this alien race is inspired by this person's writing. This alien race is inspired by this person's writing. This alien race is inspired by this person's writing. Because I've read all the books that they've apparently based Traveler's core alien races on. Does that mean they're the same? No, they're differences, but not enough differences that I don't recognize them from where they come from. Especially since I was a big science fiction reader and still am most of my life. I actually have read less fantasy, although I've read a lot of fantasy, than I did science fiction. But most of what I read was stuff written in the 50s, 60s, and 70s because my library didn't have new books as often as I liked. So a lot of it is older, which means I ran into all of those references in the past. It's really funny because a friend of mine and I were talking, and one of his favorite authors and one of his favorite books is the first example of the psychic ninja cat girl. Of course, she's not actually a ninja. She's sneaky, though. And I had never read it. And I'm like, really? It really is the person? He goes, yeah. So I went and looked it up. And it's a book called Northstrilia. North Australia, by the way. Northstrilia. Which is just, it's an amusing as heck book. It's funny. But it does have the psychic cat girl in it. And I know I've seen that in lots of different other things out there in fictions. But it was the first one that apparently used it. Which makes me laugh because I never stumbled upon it. And there's a lot of stuff that I have stumbled upon, so the fact that I hadn't means that I was missing out. But that's the thing. I'm interested in the original or semi-original or even files numbered off alien races in Star Frontiers. I'm interested in the ones in Alternity. At least some of them, not all of them. The more unique ones from Alternity, like the Sishayan, I think they're brilliant. I don't know where they came from, if they were inspired, or if they were just totally dreamt up in a writer's head that created the game species. But I like it. But the new company doesn't have those rights. And the company that's trying to get the Star Frontiers license doesn't have rights to those alien races either. So for me, that makes their games a no-go. So when you're creating a role-playing game, if you're a creator and you want to create something interesting and new, you can use inspiration. File the numbers off, you can use inspiration. But the important thing to remember is that your creation, the important stuff, is the meat, the fiction behind things. Your fiction that explains the alien races, your version of cat people, if you have cat people. which amuses me because most of the alien races in my head, while I have played cat people and dog people and all these other things, because they're fairly common, I played a lot of weirder aliens too. And I've got a lot of crazy ones up here, like metal dolphins. I know where they came from, what inspired me, but it's a little hidden tidbit that I don't think anybody else found but me and one friend of mine. And it's not in that thing anymore. Apparently it was edited out. And I'm like, But a visit from my other dog, the small one that I adopted in Halloween. You can just barely see his tail back there. Anyway, it just amuses me. Because the other one's back there too. Anyway, but that's the same. The creation, the fiction, the aliens, the fantasy creatures, as long as you're not basing them on mythology and folklore or the like, when you create that, that's the important thing. When you make it your own, that's the important thing. Don't try and buy the name of a game that's already out there and then create something that has no heritage back to the original. I mean, at least Alternative uses a sort of similar rule system, simplified version of the original Alternative rules set. At least it has that. It doesn't have alien races, so it's less interesting to me. But that's one of the things. Then again, I tend to create my own stuff with space opera and sci-fi anyway. But that's sometimes it's like when I want to play a game that other people are running. I'm like, oh yeah, I know that game. I want to play that. So that's what you want to do when you're creating. Is you want to remember that the name of your game, the title of somebody else's game, it's not really worth as much as you're probably paying for it. Because if people are buying your game, and it's a new company owning that name with no relation to the old content, then you would have probably bought it even if it had a different name, which is where I'm at. It's like, if you sell me good content, the product identity, the intellectual property, I'm like, okay, that's cool. I like it. I enjoy this. The name is less important to me. But companies do it. They do it with books. They do it with, let me give you a big example. I adore the movie The Secret Life of Walter Mitty with Danny Kaye. Ran into it when I was a kid on some channel and have loved it ever since. Now, here's the thing. It has almost nothing to do with the original book. So while they sold me on different content, if I had been looking for the name and stumbled upon that movie, I'd have been staring at the screen going, I don't know what that is. This is, there's a little tiny similarity, but were they drunk when they made this movie by that name? Because the truth is, they're not really closely related. I don't know about the new Secret Life of Walter Mitty that came out several years ago. I didn't have any interest in it because I have the Danny Kaye version. And no, I've never read the original book, but I looked it up. I looked it up and read about it and was like, okay, that does not sound like this movie at all. It really doesn't. It doesn't have the craziness that goes on in a Danny Kaye movie. But that's the point when you get down to it. The point is, are you selling the name? Or are you selling the interesting stuff within it? Like for me, the second thing, even though it's not related to the book, the stuff is more interesting than what was in the book, from what I've read about it. But, that's where I'm at, and that's what I'm trying to bring to you, is think about it. Think about it hard. Because there's no sense going and buying some other company's name and slapping it on a book if you're not carrying their content, the important stuff, the fiction, the heart of the material forward. But it's just like the Marvel superhero role-playing games. We've had 4 Marvel superhero games. 1 is great. 1 was good. 2 depend on your audience if you like them or not. But they don't have the fan base of the very first one. The very first one has a huge fan base. So the Marvel Universe is not as big a selling as people think it is for games. Superheroes don't sell it as well as fantasy. That's just the truth. People like fantasy. They like that better. I love superhero games, so I'm looking at the new Marvel game that's coming out. But it doesn't have the original rules from the very first one, so am I going to like it? I don't know. But I'm not buying it because it's the Marvel content. I'm buying it because I like superhero games. And if it does things well, I might like it. But that's the thing. It's like, I want the content, but I get that from comic books. And I'm willing to try game rules of every type, because I have played, or tried to play, every version of a superhero game with the Marvel name on it. I've also done the same with DC, except the last one that used the same rules as Mutants and Masterminds 3rd Edition. Because I had already decided that I didn't like Mutants and Masterminds 3rd Edition. So it was like, okay, I'm done. Now, I'm not saying Mutants and Masterminds was bad. Do not take me for saying that. It just wasn't for me. I didn't like it. I'm much more of an Icons kind of guy, or an old MSH, Marvel Superheroes role-playing game, phase rip kind of guy. So, this has a two-way street kind of thing going on. Is when I was a kid and first played Marvel content helped sell it. Now that I'm an adult, the Marvel content isn't going to sell it, but whether it does superheroes well, is. So, it's kind of a two-way street. But don't think about it too hard. Just enjoy. Peace and good game.